Hello and welcome to our panel, Audacious Plans, Pragmatic Approaches to Ocean Conservation. I'm Melissa Garvey, the Nature Conservancy's Global Director for Ocean Protection and the lead for the Conservancy's Blue Bonds for Ocean Conservation Strategy. Today, we will be speaking with several experts in the field of finance and development about financing ocean conservation. I'm honored to be joined by our panelists, and they are Kevin Bender, the Deputy Managing Director for NatureVest, Fiona Stewart, the lead financial sector specialist for finance, competitiveness, and innovation at the World Bank, Marlena Hurley, the Managing Director, Political Risk Insurance and Reinsurance for the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, and Jill Dauchy, CEO of the Potomac Group. Thank you for joining us, panelists. I look forward to our discussion. But before we go into the panel questions, I want to take a short moment to frame the conversation for today. More than 3 billion people rely on the ocean for their livelihoods worldwide, and an expected global population of 9 billion by 2050 will only require producing even more food, more energy, and jobs from the ocean. For developing coastal countries, ocean-based industries are key sources of income and drivers of economic growth. Now, science shows us that by putting effectively and equitably managed systems of protected and conserved areas at the heart of our development, not only can we help drive the global recovery from COVID-19, but we can also make environments, economies, and communities even more resilient. But nonetheless, marine conservation, as designated by Sustainable Development Goal 14, continues to be the least funded of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I think this is a missed economic opportunity and one with potentially dire consequences. Today, the challenge of financing the sustainability of oceans is compounded by the global COVID-19 health pandemic and the financial crisis, which has placed unrelenting pressure on public finances and slashed tourism revenues. Government leaders face a number of very urgent priorities, whether strengthening economic resilience, tackling large-scale unemployment and inequity, or rejuvenating dysfunctional healthcare systems. The list goes on and on. And meanwhile, the importance of protecting our oceans remain paramount for a more resilient future. But how do we finance that protection in times of crisis? Well, these are complex challenges that require partnering with multiple and diverse sectors, whether nonprofit, multilateral agencies, and governments, and we must be developing a suite of solutions. There's no single solution. From the G20's Debt Services Suspension Initiative, fiscal relief efforts to align COVID-19 recoveries with development goals, to NGO-led debt conversions that enable countries to scale their ocean protection commitments, audacious visions are being supported by pragmatic partnerships to unlock sustainable funding for conservation and climate change. Today, this panel will look at opportunities and challenges for unlocking sustainable funding for marine conservation. And as far as format for today, I'm going to start with questions for each of our panelists, and then we're going to move into discussion. But before answering your first question, panelists, I ask that each of you please share a short introduction of yourself. Kevin, can you please introduce yourself and then walk us through the Nature Conservancy's current debt conversion structure and describe how that strategy helps countries address and finance marine conservation?
Thank you, Melissa. My name, as you said, is Kevin Bender. I am the Deputy Managing Director of NatureVest, which is a department within the Nature Conservancy that works on impact and commercial and capital market financing for sustainable financing for conservation. And I'm the Deputy Managing Director for what we call the Blue Bonds, or the Debt Conversion Program. What I want to quickly walk you through to set the foundation for what we're going to talk about here today is the product that the active product that we're working on at NatureVest, or the Nature Conservancy, with many countries currently. And this is based on what many of you probably are familiar with, is our work that we did in the Seychelles a few years back in 2016, which took many years to build, and we have altered that product a little bit. The Seychelles deal was bilateral Paris Club debt that we were restructuring, and now we have moved to commercial financing, capital market or commercial loan financing. But the structure that we put in is much larger than the debt conversion. So I want to take a step back and talk about the three components that we address when we do these quote unquote debt conversions, because it's a misleading title. And that when we do a debt conversion, we restructure existing debt to create more favorable financing for a government, which results in cash flows for conservation, sustainable cash flows for conservation that go on hopefully in perpetuity. But it also provides economic benefit in local recirculation of some finances back into the local economy, and often has a component of reducing debt or reducing interest payments and or extending the tenor. But alongside of that, we establish TNC is a conservation group, not an investment bank. We offer much more benefit on the conservation side in that we establish a conservation trust fund on the ground to implement and disperse these sustainable cash flows. And that is set up as an independent entity on the ground. And we also work within a marine spatial plan that we help a government design and implement, and that takes many years to go forward. And a marine spatial plan is not necessarily a conservation plan. It's everything. So it's shipping, it's fishing, it's offshore drilling, offshore wind, and within that we work with the government. In return for all this work, we work with the government to put 30% protection of their ocean footprint, the EEZ and the terrestrial sea, into marine managed areas. Half of that, 15%, would be in high protection, and the rest in more flexible protection. So quickly, our structure works this way: is we work with Euro bonds, capital markets debt, or commercial debt that we can buy at a discount. Many countries are often selling at a discount. We know in the global capital markets that we can find this debt and price this debt accurately. With the loans, it's a more of a negotiation, a one-on-one with a bank. But we get that debt at a discount, and that discount creates the grant at which we can reduce some of the principal of the government and provide more favorable terms to the government. So we issue bonds through our SPV that we've set up. Those bonds go out. We use those bonds to go out in the market and buy the debt, whether it's bonds or loans. And then we issue new debt to the government on more favorable terms. Now, the loan that we make to the government to purchase that debt, or the loan that we restructure into, is heavily credit enhanced by DFC in this case, and Marlena is here to speak to that. And that allows us to borrow in the market at a much lower rate. And then the difference between the rate and adding the discount of the market that we get, we can create these cash flows for conservation. So in what we were accomplishing by going to the capital markets as opposed to the bilateral creditors, is we can find a much larger universe, and we can scale and come up with more, because there are fixed costs. If we can't get above the fixed cost of the project, we need certain size to get to those, and this allows us to go into those capital markets and attract the large deals that we can get the financing for. As I said, we do put in place the negotiation with the government that they will put 30% of their ocean under protection, under marine managed areas. And then there is a penalty that if they do not reach those, and we map those out over several years, and we have grace periods and the like. But if we don't, if the government does not meet those, then they lose the benefit of what we structured, and they have to go back and pay the rates that they were paying before, plus what they've saved over the years that this has been enacted. That money will go back to the endowment, and will be if they rectify the penalty and they reach the milestone, say putting 10% by year 2024 under protection. They don't meet that milestone. When they do meet the milestone, they get the money back. It goes into escrow. We don't make money off of this. If they don't do it, it goes into the endowment and goes onto the ground. So into conservation on the ground. So the benefits quickly are: the government gets often a reduction in principal, a reduction in interest, and extension of tenor, and the ability to manage their debt management strategy. And then within the same, we carve out a portion of the debt that services the conservation cash flows, which are sustainable and mapped out on a 20-year basis, often by a 6-month payment. And the payment of the new debt and the conservation debt is cheaper than the debt that they're paying now. So I think we can get to more questions on the nitty-gritty of the structure after.
Thanks, Kevin. We appreciate that. Fiona, let's move to you. Fiona, if you could please introduce yourself and then tell us what opportunities the World Bank is exploring to finance marine conservation, or other opportunities that you see in other sectors that could be modified to create sustainable marine conservation finance.
Thanks, Melissa. So my name is Fiona Stewart. I'm part of the Finance and Markets Broad division of the bank. I sit in the long-term finance team. We work on capital market development. My background actually is with pensions, insurance, so the institutional investor side of the story. And I think that's actually important in itself, is that I'm not from the environment team, I'm not from that side of the house, but we are very much trying to work across the house and across the organisation to work on these issues. And it's not just the conservation side, the finance side comes in as well. So I think that's an important message from the bank in itself. And the way that we've been looking at this, the role that we play is very much in greening financial markets overall. So blue, I would say, as well as green for the conversation very much today. We see that from two sides, both the greening finance and financing green. So on the greening finance, on the risk side of things, which we think is very important, some of the things we're doing is really trying to make sure that supply chains and industry practices are increasingly sustainable, and using the power of the financial sector to really influence the real sectors. So, for example, IFC, private sector investing colleagues, have been doing work in the shipping sector, for example, on filters for ballast water, new sustainable fuels. So really pushing through financial investments to really green or blue some of the sectors, such as shipping, for example. We also have quite an important role, I think, as a data provider. All this, what gets measured, gets invested, gets taken into the risk side. So we do a lot of work on natural capital accounting, and a new Changing Wealth of Nations that's coming out will actually include marine and blue as part of those natural capital accounts, which we think is very important, again, for really raising the importance of the sector and the financial sector really beginning to understand its value, and also the implications of biodiversity, nature, including marine loss on investments, on portfolios, on loans, etc. And also, on that sense, we keep saying that nature is the new climate. Nature is where climate was sort of 5 years ago. And I think you can almost say blue is the new green. Again, it's very much coming up the agenda. And for the first time, we've been doing stress testing of climate risk for banks and financial sectors for a while now. For example, as part of our financial sector assessment programs we do with the IMF. We're just starting to look at stress testing for nature. So we're now taking a methodology that was done by the Dutch central bank and using that in a country in Latin America, hopefully doing one in Asia, to begin to understand what the risk to this biodiversity and nature loss is, and through that to really change the behaviour of the financial sector. And then just quickly on the opportunity side, on the financing green or financing blue side, Kevin, what you said I think is important. We're really taking a more holistic look and try to look at this from a broader, rather than just one project by one project or one sector by one sector, and much more on the land, on a sort of landscape basis, but on the marine, on a sort of marine protected area, more of a basis. So we're looking at, as you say, what can we do to have sustainable fishing practices? What can we do to support nature-based solutions and coastal protection and insurance? How we can then put that together and scale and stack. So once you have the scale of a broader area and start to stack investments, start to stack cash flows from different sources, then you can blend and then you can really have some impact. So Mozambique's an example of a country where we're looking at different sectors and trying to build those together more into programs on a more holistic level. So it's quite a new approach. We have a big pro-blue trust fund that's very much taking this holistic approach, which I think is very important to really getting up the agenda again and really scaling going forward.
Well, I look forward to digging into that more in the discussion. Let's next move to Marlena. Marlena, please introduce yourself and then tell us a little bit more. We know that DFC has been heavily involved in the debt restructuring that the Nature Conservancy is working on. So can you discuss the role that DFC and insurance play in that structure and share what opportunities you see for other public and private insurance products in debt solutions for marine conservation financing.
Thank you, Melissa. It's a pleasure to be here on this panel today and discuss how we can work together on marine conservation financing solutions and more generally climate finance solutions. Let me first briefly introduce myself and DFC's role in this. I am the Managing Director for the Political Risk Insurance Underwriting Group at DFC, and I've been working with the Nature Conservancy over the past 2 years to establish the Blue Bonds for Marine Conservation Program. DFC stands for U.S. International Development Finance Corporation and is America's development bank. It was launched in January 2020, about a year ago, with expanded investment capacity to modernize and expand our predecessor agency, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. DFC provides both debt and equity capital, as well as technical assistance, and, which is my area of expertise, political risk insurance. Insurance helps protect investors against some of the common risks associated with investing in emerging markets. Our mission is to mobilize private capital to advance development in emerging markets, and that there's a particular focus on supporting investments in lower income countries. We partner with private businesses, nonprofits, and development institutions that share our commitment to achieving a positive development impact. President Biden's executive order of climate change has called on DFC and other government agencies to develop a climate finance plan to help developing countries decarbonize, protect critical ecosystems, and build resilience against the impacts of climate change. We will continue to work with other countries and partners, both bilaterally and multilaterally, to put the world in a sustainable climate pathway. Over the past 2 years, we have been developing a program to support the Nature Conservancy in its efforts to create long-term funding for marine conservation activities through debt restructurings around the world. DFC provides political risk insurance, specifically expropriation insurance in the form of a claim payment if the host government fails to pay an arbitral award related to the Nature Conservancy's loan agreement or Blue Bond with the host country government. These projects are considered to be highly developmental because they reduce the host country's debt burden through an innovating financing structure while creating significant long-term cash flows for marine conservation activities. Many host country governments are committed to investing in conservation activities but are constrained by high debt burdens and therefore are unable to source the low-cost capital needed to invest in essential conservation activities. TNC's pipeline of countries has an average gross government debt as a percentage of GDP of 67 to 70%, which is higher than the average for emerging market countries. Sometimes the debt to GDP ratio far exceeds this average, especially when we talk about the small island economies that are heavily dependent on tourism and have suffered greatly as a result of the COVID pandemic. We understand that most biodiversity finance is currently generated from the public sector, but recent studies have shown that funding must increase substantially beyond what is available from the public sector. And this is where political risk insurance comes in, as it can mobilize large amounts of private capital for long-term investments in conservation activities. In other words, DFC supports TNC's projects because these projects do not add to the host country government's debt burden. They reduce it. And they generate new long-term cash flows for marine conservation activities supported by private capital. The TNC program is just one of many investment structures that DFC and other political risk insurance markets can support. We can provide political risk insurance for various types of investments, including debt investments to both public and private entities in the form of bond issuances or loan agreements. But we can also insure equity investments or other types of capital at risk, such as management contracts or other types of contracts. This insurance protects against inconvertibility of currency, expropriation with breach of contract and arbitration award default, and political violence of all forms. For example, DFC could provide political risk insurance for equity and debt investments in climate-resilient infrastructure, investments in reforestations based on a host country government agreement on carbon offsets, and other types of investment. The political risk insurance market is large and includes both public and private insurers across the globe. DFC has a mandate to be additional to the private market, so we often take on risks that the private market is unwilling to take. In many cases, we serve as primary insurer and seek reinsurance from the private market in order to share our risk and also to help diversify their portfolios. Of course, there are many types of insurance that don't have anything to do with political risks, but play an integral part in ocean conservation. For example, hurricane insurance. We are open and interested in exploring other types of transactions that help all of us reach our common goal of addressing climate change, protecting ecosystems, and increasing climate resiliency around the world. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to be on this panel with you today. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Marlena. We really appreciate that. Let's switch gears a little bit. Jill, if you could please just introduce yourself and then walk us through the debt market dynamics pre-COVID, as well as share the impacts of COVID and the official sector response as well. I'm really curious to hear you tell us about what efforts there have been to link the benefits to conditionalities such as climate or health that we might be able to think about applying to marine conservation as well.
Sure, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. First of all, my name is Jill Dauchy. I am the founder and CEO of Potomac Group. We are a financial advisory firm based in Washington, D.C., and we specialize in advising sovereign governments on issues of debt, with particular expertise on debt management and debt restructuring. So I think when we think of pre-COVID and the debt dynamics that have been happening, it's important to realize and emphasize that for the last 5 to 10 years, really since the global financial crisis, we've been living in a market of extraordinary features. I mean, it's just been an unusual time of extremely low interest rates globally, but particularly in the developed markets, and in many cases, negative interest rates, with an enormous amount of liquidity in the market. So you have a lot of money that's actually looking for a place to be invested and to get a return. At the same time, you've had on the emerging market side, and that's including frontier markets and even very low-income countries, a need to find new sources of financing. Over the same period of time, they've seen a steady decline of the traditional sources of concessional financing from their multilateral and traditional bilateral partners. And so they've had to look for new sources. They've turned to new lenders, in particular China, as well as to the international capital markets, where they have found those institutional investors who are indeed looking for a higher return in riskier places. So pre-COVID, you already saw a rapid accumulation of debt in the emerging markets. In Africa alone, pre-COVID, you saw 16 countries that were already at high risk or already in debt distress. That's before the external shock of COVID. So when that shock hits, they have very little room to maneuver. They don't have the fiscal space to suddenly pivot for economic stimulus or their health programs or even purchasing PPE equipment or ventilators or vaccines. They just don't have that ability. So the international community then says, okay, well, we need to step in and help these vulnerable populations, and particularly also countries that were commodity producers or reliant on tourism. With the collapse of global trade and the travel restrictions, those countries were impacted very, very heavily. So the international community then says, okay, we need to step in and support these countries. The natural place now for those efforts was the G20, because in its membership already included the traditional lenders, as well as China, Saudi Arabia, which was, of course, also holding the presidency of the G20 last year, India, and other emerging lenders. And so they came together and said, okay, we need to come up with an initiative. You mentioned in your opening statement the DSSI, which is the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. That was available to 73 low-income countries, where if they requested the support, they would get an automatic suspension of principal and interest payments over a period of time. That was also extended. And then the G20 sat down and said, okay, well, that's a liquidity relief for some countries, but many countries are actually experiencing solvency issues. Their problems are deeper. And so now they've introduced what's called the Common Framework, which is a more comprehensive look at the debt picture of a country and looking at how can we have a comprehensive restructuring that probably will involve the private sector and commercial creditors. And so that's where the opportunity, I think, for linkages and perhaps kind of stitching together these various global initiatives for conservation as well as debt relief. I'll stop there and thank you again for having me on the panel. I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Well, thank you, Jill. Thank you, panelists. All right, let's dig into some discussion. Jill, I want to stick with you. So some of the last comments you made were about linking any debt restructuring. How can these efforts on debt restructuring or forgiveness be linked to sustainable development goals for marine conservation? What are some of the strong linkages that you see that some possibilities in this space?
I think on a very basic level, the Common Framework is based on precedents that have been set over decades of previous debt crises using kind of the methodologies that were developed in the Paris Club. And in the old days, the Paris Club agreed minutes, which was the method for restructuring sovereign debt, those agreed minutes always had a clause involved that stipulated that the debtor country had the option to seek debt swaps or debt conversions for debt for nature or others. I think the Common Framework will also involve that same sort of mechanism and language. And then it's going to be really up to the debtor country as well as the creditors to kind of come together and see if they can incorporate that into the debt relief discussions. And there's also an enormous appetite in the market, and it's important, I think, in this conversation to highlight that, from the investor community. So institutional investors and their clients, so the pension funds, the insurance companies, and just the likes of you and me who are investing in this, we're pushing those institutional investors for ESG products. So there's a big appetite for those products, and the issuers know it. And so there's a lot of discussion of how to issue bonds or blue bonds or green bonds or tie it to particular projects. And I think we need to kind of, and this is why this panel exists, is kind of get creative and innovative in how we can stitch together these various forces that are happening today in the market.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to jump in with some opportunities that they see in this space?
I think, just to jump in, Jill, I think there's several pieces to this jigsaw, as you're saying, that are super interesting at the moment, but I think need unpicking to some extent. So there's the debt restructuring, as you say, the whole debt restructuring exercise for countries that are in difficulty. But there's also a huge opportunity for ongoing, refinancing and ongoing debt from countries. And I think almost the starting point is to say, because the sort of debt for nature swaps is back, it's trendy, and lots of countries in policymakers are hearing about this at the moment, and they're almost coming to institutions like ours and asking about this. And I think we almost need to stop at first to say, well, what's the problem you're trying to solve, and what's the right instrument for that? And we're sometimes getting countries almost coming and asking about debt for swaps, and they, well, you're not in difficulty, so that may not be the instrument that you need. We may need a precious restructuring and capital and the guarantees that Marlena and everyone uses for other countries. You might be better off thinking about a blue bond or a use of proceeds bond or whatever. So I think there needs to be a first step about thinking through better what the policy advice is to countries. And then I think there's a huge opportunity in the existing broad sovereign bond market. As you know, many of the institutional investors, the biggest part of their portfolio is sovereign bonds. So how do we link that broad, the closer we can get to the broad market, the broad instruments, so we're not fragmenting the market into more and more esoteric instruments, the broader we can get to, the closest we can get to a broad sovereign bond, but link it, either it's through these use of proceeds, I think that's what the labeled bonds have done very well, but I think there's a lot of interest in results-based financing, so with key performance indicators. So you actually change the cost of capital if you hit these indicators. If we can link those in some way, can we do a sovereign, sustainable, linked, results-based bond in some way? I think that could be super interesting. And things like marine protected areas, that we have clear policy guidance, we know how to monitor, we know how to measure over time. These are the sort of, and many of them might be baked into NDCs, for example. So governments have already signed up to these commitments. That I think could be super interesting in terms of really more moving the broad market and moving from use of proceeds to really incentivizing results and ambitions of countries. So I think it's a super interesting time at the moment.
Thank you. Well, let me prompt one other question, which is, let's flip to the other side a little bit. Let's talk about investors. What are investors prepared to pay or to give up to make these products work? And how do we tailor investments so that they're attractive to investors? Who wants to weigh in on this one? Jill?
Well, I think it actually links to Fiona's question about the product. So I think, and the context of the conversation that's happening with the sovereigns. So if you're in a restructuring scenario, let's say a country's gone to the common framework and they've had to pull in private sector involvement and sit down with creditors about a debt restructuring, I think there the conversation then with creditors can happen very differently. And so there can be an element of linking it to debt conversions, or there can be an element of linking it to new money or new projects, or it can be within the conversation of the debt restructuring. But if it's not in that, and then it's just kind of bringing it to the market, I think it's just going to be the market forces. The investors are not necessarily going to give up something for conservation. Their purpose in the market is different, and I think it's just for the sovereign and perhaps working with its multilateral partners in terms of de-risking projects or somehow enhancing the credit to bring in those creditors and making it attractive. I'd be curious to hear what the other panelists have to say.
If I could jump in, I think I agree, Fiona, with your point that there has to be, many solutions, and we need to sit down and have a real financial advisory conversation with the debt management units of the world and figure out what the best thing is. I do always get back to the question of, and on that note, new issuance is a whole new ball game and a larger world than restructuring, right? It is the sovereign bond world. Getting the trick is getting the benefit to the market, right? The market will give you a few basis points from what we've seen, because it's a very large market. If we can credit enhance these, we can get to $1 trillion market where we can just find this 0.01% that will buy the bond, and we can drive down a few basis points, right, on the cost. But getting to like the outcome achievements and the climate achievement, the blue economy, the blue protection achievements, and having that pay off is kind of the missing step that I'd like to understand better. And Jill and Marlena, on your side, it would be great if we could do that at DFC, right? Because then it's in-house. We do all the protection. That's ostensibly what we're doing. But the more we can do it behind the scenes, the easier it is for the market to just digest it, put it into a rating, and then and clear the issuance. But Jill, going forward with the general agreement, how is it that what we need, in an ideal world, what we would have is some type of punitive stick for the commercial investors, right? The capital markets or the commercial loans. Is there any sign that that's going to be happening, that you will have to take a haircut, or there will be something, you have to extend the tenor? Because in that case, we could just work on linking, groups like TNC and the World Bank could just work on linking it to the right natural infrastructure or ocean protection or whatever. That's pretty easy to do. Or we could come in with our structure and say, look, that's punitive. We'll buy you out at 85 cents on the dollar, right? And we can restructure it then and create those incentives. So I don't know, do you see anything on the commercial side that's going to force them into something they don't want to do, or are they just going to sit around and wait for,
I think what we're seeing, right? I think what we're seeing with the common framework, and it's new, but at the same time, it's, like I said, it's based on precedent of Paris Club and previous responses to debt crises. But what we're seeing is that it's going to be anchored in an IMF analysis or IMF World Bank debt sustainability analysis. They're going to there will be greater transparency on what is the debt portfolio of a particular sovereign that's going to be going through the common framework, and that's going to be an important part to really understand what are the pressures on the country and who are the creditors. And then it's going to be a process, as it always is, of sitting down between the sovereign and its commercial creditors and bondholders. There will be committees formed, and there will be hard discussions. And I think the challenge will be is there a way to introduce into those discussions the SDG goals, and like I said, kind of meeting the appetite for new products. So is there a way to, and whether that's going to be debt conversions, such as the TNC product that it's offering, or other ideas that can be brought to the table. But that will be the opportunity. And there's a lot of discussion right now, because so far in the DSSI, I mentioned that it was open to 73 countries. 40 countries so far has stepped forward and kind of asked for that help. And the other countries, the question is, why aren't they coming forward? And often it's because they are afraid of the impact of their market access. And the rating agencies have made it clear that if a country comes for DSSI treatment, since that is limited to only bilateral assistance, there would not be necessarily a downgrade because of asking for the DSSI. However, for the common framework, where the language is much, much broader in saying there will probably be private sector involvement, the rating agencies have again clarified that if you do step forward and ask for the common framework, it will lead to a ratings action. So the official community, and I feel for you, it's a bit in a catch-22, because on the one hand, you want these countries to continue to have market access. You understand that this is a very important part of their financing packages today. But at the same time, we need that private sector involvement in debt relief efforts, as we have in the past. So I think there's a way now of getting creative because of the market dynamics and COVID and just the general, like I said, the kind of market appetite for ESG, to introduce those elements into the discussion when there are negotiations between a sovereign and its creditors.
So if I may jump in here, as I mentioned earlier, the main reason why DFC really supports these the TNC projects that involve the debt restructuring is exactly that it doesn't add to the country's debt, and especially in today's situation where so many countries that are close to the ocean, surrounded by oceans, islands, and small economies that are so dependent on the ocean for its economy, both for the generally, fisheries as well as tourism, they are really benefiting from a structure of restructuring debt and creating financing cash flows for conservation. But there are different investments that we speaking for the insurance community in general can support. But what we have to keep in mind is of course when insurers insure debt to host country governments rather than private entities, we do have to take into account the GDP debt ratio, and that really impacts insurance premiums and even capacity for supporting such projects. So that's what right now we are certainly very much focused on these debt restructurings with that create conservation flows. But ultimately, insurance can also be used for new debt issuances for countries with higher credit ratings, etc. I did want to ask Fiona about. You mentioned how we can link financing to the nationally determined contributions, NDCs. And that's actually something that I've been looking at as well, because it seems to me we have in the past supported projects where the investor was engaged in reforestation and had a contract with a government where the government guaranteed certain carbon offsets. But that was a specific arrangement, and it would be quite interesting to understand whether there are, whether the governments are really working on legislative frameworks that kind of invite more investment in that, that want to take carbon offsets into account. And that could also really be helpful in conservation, not just oceans, but also terrestrial. And that's not really the topic, but it could also play into the marine conservation areas. So are there any legislative efforts that you have been following? Can you talk about that a little bit?
So yeah, the offset markets are. I mean, I'm no expert, I should say, in the offset markets, and there's huge changes going on. I think with moving from sort of Kyoto to Paris, I know there's a lot of changes going on, particularly in sort of the national commitments versus in the voluntary markets. But I think there could be a really big push coming through on this. And why I think it's important is because where nature, I think, is different from climate is we're often talking about projects that don't have a cash flow, they don't have a revenue. So it's very difficult to blend into the worlds that we all work in, starting to blend and create financial vehicles until you actually have a cash flow. So if we can really get the carbon markets really starting to build and to sort of have a carbon market 2.0, I think that's a huge potential for revenue flows that you can then build into projects and really start to get value out of these natural assets that haven't been seen as having a value. It's been conservation rather than investment. I think it could be a huge game changer, definitely. But also, I think, again, it's back to this question of what investors will pay for. So again, slightly aside from the will they take haircuts in the restructuring side, we've almost sort of backed themselves into a corner, I think, a lot of investors, and they want it both ways. We want to have the green bonds and everything and all the impact, but we want exactly the same return as in the vanilla. So it's slightly been backed into the corner. So I think we have to get a lot better about measuring and showing the value of these investments over the long term, and really showing that there's lower risk both on the sort of debt sustainability side. The rating agencies are starting to build these into their considerations, into their ESG. But also on the impact side, investors really want to have impact. And some of the work we've been doing around ESG, environmental social governance, on the sovereign side, we found that a lot of the ESG indicators are actually very, very linked to wealth and linked to GDP. So ironically, you can have an ESG index that you investors want to come into to have impact and to support the SDGs, but that index can actually be more weighted to high-income countries and actually taking money away from the lower income countries that actually need the capital. So I think we need a really big rethink about what is ESG for sovereigns. What does it mean? How do we measure it? How do we have almost an ESG 2.0 for sovereigns that really adjusts for the GDP. It takes into account the forward look, as you say, a lot of the really good work some of the island states are doing in adaptation and doing in mitigation takes that into account, is more forward looking, is more relative. So I think there's a lot of work to do there. And then I think a lot of indexes and these other products can really start to sort of move capital and have the impact investors want. As you say, investors do want to, Jill. How do we make sure it's going in the right direction and give them the instruments to do that?
Can I switch gears just a little bit? I mean, you're saying that, yes, this is what investors want. What are you hearing from the governments? Jill, I know you work with sovereigns. Fiona, I know there's a lot of these different products that you're in the process of developing. Tell us how what the appetite is on the government side.
I think from the government side, there is strong interest and appetite on just a very basic level. I think as they see these market forces, they see that there's interest in the market, so they want to respond to that. They want to tap into that energy and financing, and that's kind of on a very kind of basic level. And then also, I think they are seeing new opportunities for addressing these issues in their country. And in many of my conversations with governments, I think they're going back to a comment that Fiona said earlier about the product. I think there is still a learning curve happening about what are the differences between, say, a new issuance, the blue and the green and the colored bonds, so to speak, versus the products that say TNC is offering, which is a restructuring or a conversion of existing debt, and exactly what are the benefits of that versus just going out into the market and issuing new debt with these characteristics. And I think there is a lot of interest in the part. It's obviously these questions draw upon many parts of government. So sometimes, depending on the capacity of the government, it can be a very difficult conversation, whether you're speaking to the energy ministry or the even labor, Ministry of Finance, etc. So there is an aspect of just coordination between various government bodies to understand what is needed, what are the projects. And I think as well, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in just developing the appropriate projects and setting that financing correct. So there's a lot of pieces, again, to this puzzle that's quite complicated, but I think there's definitely an interest and an appetite on the side of the sovereigns.
If I could jump in, one of the things that works well for us, because we're doing this on the restructuring side and haven't looked at new issuance or the like, is that there is definitely a lot of difficulty with the many ministries involved in getting everybody. That takes a lot of time to get everybody on the same page. But within the Ministry of Finance, the nice thing about what we're trying to achieve here today is that the Minister of Finance wears two hats, right? They don't only just look at how do I reduce my debt burden and get the best deal to finance the country. They also run the budget. So if there is no financing and there's all this desire to meet the NDCs or to put the ocean under protection, and there isn't money to do that, and we're simply restructuring old debt into the same exact cost, only now you get X millions of dollars a year for marine conservation, that's a benefit to them, even if they get no reduction. And it's just creating cash flow out of nothing. That gets a lot harder when you go into new debt, right? Because then new debt is the budget, right? And you have to now get to be top priority on the budget line to get the budget. But we do have some power with these governments because they understand, how that they need these cash flows, and we can create.
Anyone else want to jump in on that question? Just to say, I think as well as the instruments, as you said, and we have seen, the number of countries interested in moving from the use of proceeds to these other types of bonds. But even just things like this coalition of finance ministers, we provide the Secretariat support for that. That's like well over 50 countries now have joined this coalition. As you say, Kevin, the conversation is moving out of the environment ministries and into the finance ministries. And I think that in itself is hugely influential. and the central banks. The NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, the huge role people like Mark Carney are playing to really get this conversation across and out of conservation and nature and environment into the finance, I think is a huge sign of the appetite for countries, and very, very, very encouraging.
Thanks, Fiona. I want to jump to, I think this might be one of our last questions, and I'd really like to get a response from everyone, which is, from your perspective where you sit, what do you need from the other sectors, whether it's governments or NGOs or multilaterals or the private sector? What do you need to be successful in generating the needed finance for something like marine conservation? How can we better collaborate and coordinate our efforts? Who wants to go first? Can I pick on you, Marlena?
Sure. For us, of course, as a development finance corporation, we are very much interested in supporting TNC and other similar projects. In a way, we depend on TNC to structure this. We are really behind TNC or other investors, so we are not really negotiating with the governments directly. What we need what we need to see, what we generally look for when we evaluate our project, is how responsive the governments are, and generally in making the project happen, because sometimes it can take a very long time for the project to be structured. So when the government is very supportive of TNC's efforts and know very well that DFC provides political risk insurance, that really enables the project to move forward very quickly. Sometimes we just don't know why governments aren't moving forward. This is really not something we have much insight to. What I really so that's with respect to what we need from governments, a really quick response as to whether they support that kind of project. What we would like to see, what we need from other sectors as well, I would like to get a better understanding how much private capital is out there from institutional investors like pension funds and insurance companies on supporting this kind of restructuring or other types of marine conservation efforts. That would be very interesting to understand, because that could help us mobilize more capital with political risk insurance in combination with other agencies and the private market.
Fiona?
Yeah, maybe I could. Oh. Okay, I could go maybe quickly, because we work on active deals, and I know exactly where the gaps are. And one thing that we struggle with, the two things we struggle with is, as Marlena was saying, Fiona was saying, that and even Jill, that there are many ministries that we have to work with, and we have to get everybody aligned and agree to it. While we're doing that, we're subject to market pricing, because we're looking at the bond market. So when we start talking to a government at 75 cents on the dollar, and by the time we get everybody aligned in agreement, we're at 95 cents on the dollar, it's not as attractive. And we keep them aware of the situation, but this has happened. And if we look at it, the markets are at crazy highs. Where it's historically we're looking at low prices, and that we're our high prices, and everything's going above par, even with unless you have a really stably default situation, country in a bad situation. So one of the things that we would like to see, because that is cyclical, the markets do go up and down. We can't move fast enough to time the markets. So if we had grant financing that could come in and say, you can start your trust fund, we're going to do 5 years of financing, regardless of if we get the market price or not. And assuming that in 2 years' time we'll get the market price, we could launch our restructuring. And if we could just get the Conservation Trust Fund working with grants ahead of time, then we could even repay those grants, right? We could take them out, because we could, we build the cash flows, and we can pay out over time or in a lump sum on the transaction. But we need to get the transactions to market in a manner that's not as exposed to market price fluctuation.
So from my side, I would love investors to really use the power that they have, and I think they're just beginning to realise the power that they have as the voice for the financial sector to really impact on the government sector and on the real sector as well. So, for example, I think things like the Climate 100 Plus initiative that really had the big investors really had big impact in really moving both the corporate sector and the policy agenda on the climate side. I think we need something like a Nature 100 Plus to really for the investors to come together and really focus on this. Let's make it Nature 100 Blue. Let's make the blue even more up the agenda for investors. They're starting to engage, investors on deforestation. You mentioned, Marlena. Lets them realize that through the sort of valuations we're doing, just the value of the oceans and the value of their portfolios to governments and also to the private side, if they realize that and can start to use their voice, I think that can have a huge impact. And we're trying to think about how we help investors and governments engage with each other. So, for example, we have the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure on the corporate side. What would a TCFD for sovereigns look like? How could we use that sort of framework that the financial sector is used to try and engage with governments so they can explain their policies, explain their sort of long-term development policies in a way that investors really understand and then can begin to price into the markets that we're all working in. So I think really understanding the power that they have and giving them ways to engage with governments, I think, and then we can all come in with products and a technical assistance and a lending. But using that voice, I think, for the investors to start to use that voice, particularly in the marine conservation area, as they have elsewhere, I think would be hugely powerful.
And I think if I'm taking the voice of the sovereign, for instance, I think that all of these initiatives are incredibly important. And I think from the perspective of the governments, it really does take that official sector support in, as you say, kind of mobilizing or giving platforms or incentivizing those conversations with commercial creditors and helping to organize the conversation. And of course, the work of the TNC is essential. And I think Kevin's point of trying to figure out a way of making the actual product of the debt conversion less susceptible to market forces would help governments, because then it's not just at a moment where you're coming to a government in its moment of crisis. And so you're trying to negotiate a very hard thing when things are going very badly. If there is a way to kind of build that pipeline in better times and maybe kind of build a ramp to it or figure some other way of implementation, I think that could be of great value to the sovereigns, because I think right now we're coming to them, or the way the structure is set up is that it has to be when there is that default situation or prices are very low, where of course governments are then very stretched thin already. And so coming up with innovations to have these discussions at different moments in the cycle, I think would be enormously helpful.
Great. Well, thank you, Jill, Marlena, Fiona, and Kevin for a really interesting discussion on this important topic, and you all give us great hope. I also want to thank our audience. If you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to visit the Nature Conservancy's virtual booth. Thank you and goodbye.